Welcome to Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome to the Writers on Film podcast. My name is John Bleasdale, I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Jason Wood. Jason is the writer of many books, including single studies on Hal Hartley and Steven Soderbergh. He is currently the artistic director of Home, the Arts Centre in Manchester. But today we're going to be talking about his new book, which is an updated is an updated version of the Faber Book of Mexican Cinema, and particularly the Renaissance in Mexican cinema, which has taken place over the last 10-15 years or so. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and generally spread the word. You can also follow me on Twitter at drjonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, enjoy the conversation.
I went for the first book in 2006, which was quite an odd thing. So I don't speak Spanish, and I went for quite a long time in Mexico City, which is quite a tough city. And I was there on my own, and it was kind of interesting getting to grips with it. But I've been back a couple of times since. I went to a couple of festivals in Guadalajara. I mean, it's a great country, but, you know, as they say in the book, it's a country of extremes. You know, it is a very violent country, but it's also a country where the Mexican people are incredibly kind and sharing. And, you know, if you're a guest in their country, they really make you feel welcome. Reminded me of when I went to Poland, and you know, that sense that, you know, that there is a lot of hardship and poverty, but, you know, they want to transcend that and show that they are good people and kind people. So yeah, it was quite an eye opener as a trip, I have to say.
Did your interest in Mexican cinema sort of predate you visiting, or did you visit and think, I'd like to know more about this culture and get into it via film?
My interest in Mexican cinema was actually a film directed by a Spaniard who was in Mexico. It was a film that I saw very, very early in my life on British television, when British television showed a lot more foreign language films. And I stayed up one night and I happened to catch a screening of Buñuel's Los Olvidados, which is a film set amongst a kind of Mexican street kids. Again, a film of real hardship, but also a film of real poetry. And there was just something about that film that really captured me. I think it was that dichotomy between cruelty and beauty. So I love that film. And then I'm quite a big genre fan, and I was always interested in horror. And I remember seeing Guillermo del Toro's Cronos when it first came out at the what was then the Metro Cinema in Rupert Street in London, and I just thought it was incredible. I thought it was a really interesting take on the vampire film. I thought it was really kind of political. I really loved Ron Perlman, who was in the film, who I've remained a big fan of. I think it was Cronos that really made me kind of think, wow, there's a lot of interesting film coming out of Mexico. And Cronos was made at quite a kind of pedestrian time for Mexican cinema. You know, it was when a lot of the older brigade was still making films. Not many younger Mexican filmmakers were making films. So it was that film, and then like a lot of other people, I saw Amores Perros in Cannes, and that really kind of kickstarted the idea that there was something really exciting happening there. And Inarritu is such an interesting figure because he didn't come through the traditional film school. He didn't have a film background. He was a kind of DJ that just decided to go into cinema. And I think there was something very bracing about the fact that he didn't come from a traditional background. So yeah, those three films really, Cronos, Los Olvidados, Cronos, and then Amores Perros were the ones that really got me excited, I think.
Yeah, there seems to be, reading your book, that you get a real sense that there is a fallow period in Mexican cinema, that there's a sort of that early Buñuel-inspired
moment, and then there's sort of a lot of sex comedies and stuff that really isn't particularly interesting, and state-sponsored films that aren't particularly.
Yes.
And then you have this huge explosion, mainly centered around the figures that you cover in depth. So taking those figures maybe one at a time. Del Toro, let's begin with him as a figure. What do you think his main sort of contribution has been to the explosion of Mexican cinema?
Well, Del Toro is someone, he's a bit like a Mexican Scorsese. He lives, breathes, eats and drinks cinema. I mean, he's a real cinephile. I mean, the only other person I've met comparative to Del Toro would be Bertrand Tavernier, who Del Toro knows everything about cinema. And people think of Del Toro, quite rightly, I guess, as being associated with the horror genre or the fantasy genre. But it isn't just those genres. I mean, he really does know everything about cinema from Mexico. He studied under Humberto Hermosillo, who's one of the more traditional Mexican directors. But Del Toro really does know everything. And I think what Del Toro... There's two things that I think are really influential about Del Toro. I think he's managed to imbue the fantasy or horror genre with a real kind of signature tone. I mean, if you look at the colours in his films... particularly, I think probably the Spanish language films, Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone, but also something like Pacific Rim. If you look at the use of colour, he's got a really heightened sensibility. He reminds me of somebody a bit like Nick Rogue or Ken Russell, a kind of real visual sensorist. But the other thing which I think is really influential about Del Toro, and I don't think I even say this in the book, I may have done, is that I think people now think of the kind of blockbuster or superhero films as being films that are made with a lot more integrity and finesse than they previously were. And I think some people would trace that back to possibly Christopher Nolan with the Dark Knight trilogy. But I actually think it goes back further than that. I think if you look at what Del Toro did with something like Hellboy and Blade 2 even, I think that Del Toro was someone that really raised the stakes in terms of mainstream Hollywood. I'm not sure if superhero is the right term, but I think he kind of brought a flair and a sense of charisma and a sense of adventure to those kind of films of a comic book origin. I mean, I remember seeing Hellboy and just thinking this is brilliant filmmaking, and I love the great auteurs of world cinema, but I just thought that this was a film with a real signature style made by somebody that really wanted to imbue material that they obviously loved with their own sense of daring and adventure. And I think Del Toro probably deserves a bit more credit for how he raised the stakes in that kind of approach of comic book and genre filmmaking in general. I mean, I think his work in that regard is brilliant because, I guess a little bit like a figure like Steven Soderbergh, who, there's this theory that Steven Soderbergh would do a film for him, an independent film, and then a film for Hollywood. But I don't think there's a lot of difference between something like an Ocean's 11 and a kind of Schizopolis. I think they come from the same sensibility. And I would say the same with Del Toro. I don't think there's a big difference between a Pacific Rim and a Pan's Labyrinth. I think they've both got the same sense of detail, in terms of the visual look of the film, the characterization, the storyboarding that Del Toro does for those films is exactly the same as the storyboarding he would do for what some would consider a more personal film. And he takes every project incredibly seriously. So, yeah, I think they would probably be his two greatest contributions.
Right. And I mean, I think you're right about that thing about his reputation. I never really thought of that before, but even in terms of his choice of material, he's not going for the Superman comic book. He's going for the comic books which are much more to do with sort of appreciating the monstrous and reinventing the sort of darker hero. And this has become nowadays with the Cruella film, and it's almost become a cliche to do that, to look at the a more morally ambiguous hero. I'm gonna in the podcast, when you listen back to that, you will hear a different tone of my voice going ambiguous.
But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, Del Toro's always said he's often more interested in the monster than he is in the hero. And I really like the Hellboy character because he is a kind of ambiguous character. He comes from hell. He's full of contradictions and failings, and I think that's what makes him more interesting. And I think that a lot of people like the kind of anti-hero, and I think Del Toro is exactly the same with his interest in the monstrous characters. And I think if you look at his films and you look at the kind of monstrous characters he's created, you think of the Pale Man in Pan's Labyrinth, and they're just incredible characterizations, and the Pale Man is just one of many. You think of the Faun and again you think of the kind of villains in Hellboy 1 and Hellboy 2, and they're just so brilliantly and vividly realized that you can see that that's where his interest really lays, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even in The Devil's Backbone, where you have the ghost sort of trailing this stream of blood during the Spanish Civil War, so it almost looks like a red flag. It's there's nothing casual or incidental about the monstrous. It's all it seems to hold a genuine significance. So moving on to Cuaron, you're going to have to correct any of my pronunciation.
No, I'm a non-Spanish speaker, so my pronunciation is equally fragile.
Okay. We'll just drop in like somebody else's pronunciation. Yeah. Here, there's what I got from your book, what I got from sort of my own watching of Cuaron's movies, is the sense that there was a real possibility that he could be a sort of Mexican Ridley Scott. He could have gone into Hollywood and just kind of disappeared and produced amazing movies, technically brilliant, but no more Mexican than G.I. Jane is a British movie, and he kind of doesn't do that. I think that's a really brave decision. Well, I mean, do you think that's am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing about these Mexican directors, and I know we're going to go through them, there's the kind of big four, if you like. But the other thing with these Mexican directors, they're all incredibly proud to be Mexican. It's for them, it's a real badge of honor. It's a real point of principle. They recognize the contradictions in their country. They recognize the kind of failings of their own film institutions. Cuaron especially has been very critical of some of the kind of state-sponsored cinema and INCINE, which is the Mexican equivalent of the British Film Institute. He's been quite outspoken, but it's because he wants a better cinema for his country. And when Cuaron, like Inarritu and Toro, when they've gone to make the films in Hollywood, they've quite often taken their sensibility with them. I think there is an intelligence to the films that they've made in Hollywood, but they've also quite often taken their crew. Del Toro would often work with Navarro, Inarritu would often work with Prieto, and Cuaron would work with his own cinematographer. So they would take a lot of their key creative personnel with them to make the films. And Cuaron has said to me that he feels that the films that he has made within America do kind of reflect a Mexican sensibility. But what they've also done, even when they've been working in Hollywood, they've stayed very active in what is happening back in Mexico. And it's true of all of the four, Regadas, Cuaron, Inarritu, and Del Toro. They've continued to be spokespeople. Well, I'm going to say spokesmen because they are all men, but spokesperson would be the right term. They've continued to be spokespersons or spokespeople for Mexican cinema, but they've also continued to kind of fight for Mexican cinema, better rights for creative personnel, better support and better industry infrastructure. They've kind of campaigned the political parties to continue to fund with vigor Mexican cinema. They've produced films by up-and-coming Mexican directors. They've attached themselves to projects to give some of these newer Mexican filmmakers coming through a kind of elevation. But I think it's also true that even when Cuaron was and Del Toro were working in America and having that kind of really good run, they were always thinking of projects they could go back and do in their homeland. And obviously Del Toro didn't go back to Mexico, but he went back to Spain with the Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, which he kind of counts as Mexican productions. Obviously Cuaron went back more recently and made Roma, which I'm sure we'll talk in more detail about, but he had been involved in producing other films. He was involved in his son Jonas's film Year of the Nail, or Año Uña. He also was involved in producing a film by his brother Carlos Cuarón's Rudo y Cursi, which again reunited the Tu Mama Tambien stars Bernal and Diego Luna. And in Inarritu, although he had actually made a project in Mexico, he did a kind of installation piece. He'd continued to work with Mexican creative personnel, and he'd continued to be very, very vocal about supporting upcoming Mexican talent. And now he has finally found a project that he is going to go back and do within Mexico. So, I think that all of them have retained this idea of Mexican identity and Mexican sensibility. They've all, whenever they've spoken, they've always spoken about how important their Mexican identity is to them. And there isn't a sense, I don't think, that they left Mexico, and once they left Mexico, they kind of closed the door on it and forgot about it. I think they all kind of kept one foot back in their homeland, and I think that what they've done for Mexican cinema in terms of raising its profile and in terms of continuing to fight for its visibility shouldn't be underestimated. And the other thing I'd say, James, I think that the films that they made within, and I think the Ridley Scott comparison is a good one. Ridley Scott is someone that makes films of a certain quality, which was obviously a subjective point of view, but I think that whatever you think of the films of Ridley Scott, they're made with a certain craft, they're made with a certain attention to detail. They're made with certain very high-end production values. Are real interested in story and narrative and character. And I think you would certainly say the same of all the films that the three, because Regadas hasn't worked in America, films that they've made in Hollywood or in English language productions. Because I'm also thinking of something like The Children of Men, which I think is an excellent film. They've all been really intelligent films. There's an intelligence to them. They're not just kind of, to put it bluntly, it's not obviously films that they've just gone and made for the money, for the paycheck.
Right.
It's obviously films that they've gone and they've made because they really believe in the material. And I don't think that they're directors that are going to take too kindly to being told what to do. I think that their vision and their sensibility is so strong that when they come aboard a project, they really kind of take control of it and make it their own.
Yeah, no, I mentioning Children of Men, I mean, even Harry Potter, the third Harry Potter, The Prisoner of Azkaban, I remember watching that at the cinema with my girls. See, I have to say that I went with my daughter and loving it and loving that film and thinking very early on, this has such a feel for England. This has such a feel for wet pavements. And then when I saw Children of Men, just being blown away by it. I mean, Children of Men is one of my favourite films of this century, undoubtedly. There's also a sense that the four filmmakers, as well as going back to Mexico, as well as sort of what you said in terms of bringing their crew with them and there being a very much back and forth. There's also a great back and forth between them as well. This you get the feeling that there's a great sense of cooperation. Del Toro turns up at Inarritu's door to help him with the editing for Amores Perros, for instance, is one incident that you bring up in the book. That feels almost unique. I mean, I don't get the feeling that. I don't know. Maybe going back to the 70s and Spielberg and Lucas showing everybody Star Wars and Brian De Palma, ripping it to pieces. Maybe a more negative example, but I don't get it feels rare to have that level of collaboration between essentially competitors.
They're all really close friends. They're all very, very supportive of each other. And you're right, they comment on each other's work. They see each other's work. And I would imagine there is a competitiveness there, but I think it's more done out of a solidarity. And the interesting thing is, and I say this in the book, and I've said it before, is that the directors, the three, Cuaron, Del Toro, and Inarritu, are the ones that have had the huge success. But the filmmaker that they really admire is Regadas.
Right.
I think they really regard Carlos. They regard themselves as artists, and I don't mean that in a kind of rarefied way. They see themselves as craftspeople. They take their craft really seriously. But I think they really see Carlos Regadas as the true artist amongst them. They see him as coming from a probably more art house or auteur background, and they really make sure that he is included in kind of all the dialogue about Mexican cinema, which I think Regadas finds quite funny, because the films of Carlos Regadas I think are very, very different to those films, which again shows the strength of depth in Mexican cinema. I think Mexican cinema isn't just one kind of filmmaking. I think it's incredibly diverse, which is something that I tried to show in the kind of update of the book, the diversity in Mexican cinema. But Regadas is kind of from the Tarkovsky school of art house, very serious art house cinema. I mean, I also think that Regadas is quite possibly a genius, but I think that Cuaron, Del Toro, and Inarritu, I think envy is the wrong word, but I think that they see Regadas as working completely on his own, without any kind of commercial imperatives, without any need to satisfy. The films of Carlos Regadas are genuinely independent. They're not made with a certain box office in mind. They're quite often made with one or two independent producers. So that there isn't this need to be making the film for an audience. And I think if you work in that way, I think you must have a great sense of freedom, which isn't to say that the other three don't work with a sense of freedom, because I think they do. I think that they're making films not necessarily to achieve a certain commercial or box office revenue. I think they're making films because they believe in them. But there obviously must be, you know, for the most part, they're studio-funded pictures. There must also be a certain pressure to deliver certain audiences. And I think that they see that Regadas works in a way which is completely independent from that, which is why I think that, you know, Cuaron returning to Mexico to make something like Roma, I think was probably an attempt to make a film which is more in the slightly personal Regadas mode, and I think that, you know, the next project which Inarritu is doing, which he's working on at the moment, will probably do something similar. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the friendship and camaraderie amongst them is very genuine. And, you know, when I was doing the follow-up book, it was very much, and they're all very generous people. I mean, I'm not just saying this to try and curry favour. I mean, you know, I've interviewed lots of, as I'm sure you have, lots of famous directors, and for the most part the experience has always been pleasant and pleasurable. But the thing I'll say about, you know, Del Toro, Inarritu and Cuaron is they're incredibly genuine and generous people, and they've been very very good to me and very kind and very supportive. And, you know, they've all reached a certain level of fame where they have assistants and PAs and people surrounding them, as all creative talents and directors do once they reach a certain level of, you know, Oscar winners, if you like.
Right.
But, you know, I would send them an email and they'd reply. You know, I think they really appreciated that I tried to do something from the cinema of their country, and that gave me a certain direct route to them. But, you know, just going back to the idea of their friendship, they were all very clear that they would, you know, and they're all very busy. They made it clear that they would take part in the second book as long as each of them was in it. You know, that It was very clear that, you know, Del Toro was, I think I can be free. Is Cuaron free and Inarritu free? So once I was able to say, everyone's gonna, then they all said, of course, we'll. So there was also a sense of, I think they wanted to make sure that none of them were going to be left out, which is why I was very keen that the cover had all of them. But I was also very keen with Faber that the cover also had Regadas, because I think he is undoubtedly possibly the lesser known, but I think he's also the one that kind of pins them all together, really. So I really wanted to make sure that there was an image from a Regadas film on the front cover, as well as ones from Del Toro, Cuaron and Inarritu.
Given that Regadas is potentially the lesser known also for our listeners, where would you point someone who hasn't seen his films and is not familiar with his work to sort of introduce him?
I think Regadas is quite, I mean, I think Regadas is made, let's see, Japón, Battle in Heaven, Post Tenebras Lux, Our Time. You know, he's made 4 films. I think that I've missed one. A film set in the Mennonite community. 5 films. And I think Silent Night. I think you could make a very strong argument that 4 of those films are masterpieces. And they are made with such an attention to detail. I think also Regadas is a filmmaker that really thinks about not just how a film looks, but how it sounds. You know, the use of sound on his films. But they're certainly not for mainstream audiences. You know, they deal with fairly heavy moral and spiritual issues. I think also, like, you know, Cuaron mentioned in the short preface to the book, you know, Mexico is quite a violent society. I think Regadas' films deal with that. They also deal in a very frank way with sex and sexuality. So that, you know, that there isn't really one of his films that you could say this is the easier entry. You know, I guess if someone listening wanted to check out one of his films, I think probably Silent Light is the one which is probably easier to immerse yourself in. It's certainly one with the least sex and violence. It's very much inspired by the Danish filmmaker Dreyer, and it's about a relationship, but it's a film that requires a leap of faith because something happens in it that you need to just kind of go with, which again is inspired by Dreyer. And I don't want to spoil it, but I think that would probably be the one to start with. But, you know, if you're watching a film by Regadas, you need to be prepared to be challenged intellectually, which doesn't mean the films are not pleasurable because they're so brilliantly made, but they are certainly very, very different to the films of Cuaron, Inarritu and Del Toro. You know, they be considered real kind of quite serious auteur and art house cinema. And I kind of think that when you label something a very serious art house film, I sometimes think that can be a dangerous thing to do, because there is humour in the films of Regadas. undoubtedly. You know, there are things that are funny, and he's a very funny man. You know, he has a very strong sense of humour. So I think to just kind of label them these austere, kind of rigorous things that you have to force yourself to sit through, I think does the films an injustice. But you certainly need to be prepared to pay attention, and you certainly need to be prepared to not necessarily be given a kind of quick fix of entertainment. But, you know, I genuinely consider the films to be quite brilliant and in their own way quite unique. And, you know, we spoke about the other filmmakers that these directors have all kind of supported, and Carlos Regadas has been a kind of long-time producer and executive producer for another Mexican filmmaker who's in the book called Ama Escalante, who I think is one of the other really interesting kind of younger generation of Mexican filmmakers, and Regadas has produced a number of his films. And the films of Ama Escalante, like the Regadas films, they're a little bit more kind of auteur driven. But the last Ama Escalante film would be a really good one for listeners to check out. It's called The Untamed, and It's more of a genre film. Yeah, I mean, I would describe it as a kind of loose homage to Andrzej Zulawski's Possession. You know, it's if people are thinking, why would I watch this film? Well, it's about a monster which is kind of sexually pleasuring men and women in this Mexican village, and I just think it's a brilliant film, and I think if you watch something like The Untamed and you kind of think, well, Carlos Regadas kind of went to bat for that film, you'd immediately see the connection between the two films and the two filmmakers.
Yeah, there seems to be that sort of there seems to be a sort of thread that connects all these filmmakers of a sort of openness to the fantastic as well. You know, you've got that in a very extreme sort of a generic thing with Del Toro, but you've also got, in terms of Regadas, with the strange horned creature of light in Post Tenebras Lux. I mean, I would almost, if I was to encourage people, which I do, to watch a Regadas film, I would maybe, not in terms of technique or theme or necessarily, but in terms of sort of viewing experience, maybe compare him a little bit to David Lynch, in the sense that you're not going to get a conventional, film, but you are not going to get something which is, I don't know, the Bellatar end of art house, where you're really going to have to sit down and learn the rules of the film in order to enjoy it.
I think that's a really good comparison, actually. I think that's spot on. You know, especially with Post Tenebras Lux, which every time I watch Post Tenebras Lux, it gets better. You know, I think that is a film that really repays repeated viewings, and I think the Lynch comparison you've made is as I said, spot on. I think there's a kind of playfulness to that film. Yeah. Which is humorous, but it is also saying, sometimes rules and conventions are there to be defied and denied and ignored, but you can kind of do it in a fun way, and I think Regadas does that. Certainly in Post Tenebras Lux, I think he absolutely does that. You're right.
We are definitely going to move on to the newer filmmakers and the next wave that are coming through, but I just want to finish this sort of roundup of the big four with Inarritu, who, as you say, comes from a really unconventional background in terms of a filmmaker, and has achieved sort of this similar heights. And really he's perhaps the person who maybe has that first breakthrough film with Amores Perros, which I think showed at Cannes, but it showed at one of the sidebars. I think it was a Critics Week sidebar, if I'm not mistaken, or was it Kanzan?
No, I think you might be right. Yeah,
right. And that seems to be almost like a year zero for the new type of. Is that a correct sort of way of looking at it?
Yeah, and the interesting thing with it, I mean, Amores Perros just felt like something incredibly new. I think it also helped that it had Gael Garcia Bernal in it, who became the kind of poster boy for Mexican cinema. And there had been other films in Mexico before, from Mexico in Cannes before that. Kronos showed in Cannes, and Cuaron had made Solo con tu pareja before he made Et tu mamá también. But I think Et tu mamá también came out quite shortly after Amores Perros, a year or so after. And I think it gave that kind of double whammy. Those two films taken together, again, both starring Gael Garcia Bernal and Diego Luna, the other really big star of Mexican cinema. I just think that those two films together really made people go, okay, wow, there's something happening here. And as you know, critics or curators or even audiences, they're quite often looking for the next thing. And I think in around that period, 2005, 2004, there was this sense that there's some really interesting stuff coming from Mexico. And as you know, once you have one or two films, it tends to inspire other filmmakers to kind of follow in their wake. And the thing that Mexico has always had, even when state funding was withdrawn, or it's always had very good film schools, and it's always had really good training facilities for filmmakers. But I think the interesting thing with Inarritu, as you've touched on, and as I said earlier, he didn't come through any of that. He was an autodidact. He was a DJ. He was more interested. He was more attuned and known for kind of working with sound. And I think Amores Perros is such an interesting film because for me, that is a film which is really about sound. I think most people are surprised when you think of Amores Perros. You think of the dogfight sequences, and you kind of you almost feel wary of revisiting it. But I've revisited it a number of times, and you don't actually see anything. You don't, the dogfighting, you see blood, but it's all in the sound. Amores Perros for me really is a film which is about a really creative use of sound. It's all in the soundtrack. And I think that really goes back to Inarritu's background. And I think it also really goes back to the way that he approached it from a really kind of independent perspective. And also because, as I mentioned with Regadas, because Amores Perros was independently produced by independent financiers, there was no state involvement. There was no state saying, we don't want this level of violence. We don't want this kind of depiction of Mexican society. We don't want, he was able to make something which was kind of truly independent, which kind of goes back to that notion that you mentioned, John, of the kind of new wave of American independent filmmakers in the 1970s. And I think there is an element of that with these Mexican directors, both in the work that they make and in that kind of sense of solidarity that you mentioned. But I think that within Inarritu, he was so full of ideas and he was so full of what the possibilities of the medium were, that I think once he made Amores Perros, he was always going to be somebody that was going to want to go off. And, not the sense that Mexico couldn't contain him, but there was always a very clear view that he wanted to, if you pardon the cliche, paint from the broadest possible palette. He wanted to work with budgets to achieve his vision. He wanted to work with the best facilities, the best crew, the best actors, because he wanted his work to be seen on the biggest and broadest canvas. But the thing I admire about Inarritu is I don't think he ever diluted his vision, and I think something like The Revenant, for me, has a lot of similarities to Amores Perros, both in terms of its subject matter and in terms of just the very technical brilliance with which it's executed. I think Inarritu is a genuinely brilliant and daring filmmaker who very much like Del Toro and Cuaron and Regadas has kind of pushed the envelope of what's available in filmmaking. I think that these directors have kind of progressed the medium. There's not that many other filmmakers that you can say that about. And I think Inarritu is incredibly ambitious in the right sense. He's someone that just wants to just wants to continue to try and make films which, as I said, test the boundaries of the medium, but which also deal with very pressing and pertinent subject matters. I don't think Inarritu is somebody that could be contained or controlled by the Hollywood production system. I just think his vision and his passion is too strong for that.
I'm also really interested in the way that there is so much technical adventurism, in the sense that with Amores Perros they use the bleach bypass technique, which you detail in, because you have a chapter on the making of the film, and then he seems to kind of like, okay, done that, and discard it. I don't need that anymore. I've done it for a couple of films, and I'll go on. And also the fact that they're doing long takes, they're doing these things which nowadays is almost become, again, it's influenced so many other filmmakers and TV shows that they're moving on. But if it was just a technical, stylistic experimentalism, there'd be a limited interest. But it's the fact that the content, the narrative, the characters are so interesting as well. It's not that, it's... we brought up Ridley Scott earlier, and he is a superb stylist, I totally agree. But he's also kind of only as good as the script he's got.
Yeah.
Whereas with these guys, they are writing their own stuff as well as directing, and that auteurism seems to be the root of their success, or their continued success.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, you've hit the nail on the head. I think that with their films, there is this sense of formal daring and experimentalism and technical brilliance. I mean, if you think of something like Gravity, which just when that came out, that film just it blew people away. But I think, but there is also this. I think they managed to ally that with a really strong sense of character. And again, I'm going to labour it. Now that you've mentioned it and it's stuck in my mind, I think that's something that was similar with the American filmmakers of the 70s, Friedkin, Lumet, Pakula, who are making quite often quite political films. But I think those films had a stylistic brilliance, but they were also underpinned by brilliant characterization and brilliant scripts. Again, you think of Scorsese and his collaboration with Paul Schrader. These were filmmakers that were interested in the possibilities of the medium, but they also wanted to take audiences on a journey in terms of the narrative and the narrative trajectory, but also the characters that they were asking you to invest 120 minutes or 90 minutes or whatever the running time with. And I think that what underpins all of these films is this sense of character. I mean, if you think of Birdman, in Inarritu's film, Michael Keaton character is basically, pardon my French, an arsehole. but you become incredibly invested in him, because he's so brilliantly written, but also so brilliantly played by Michael Keaton, and I think that was also interesting, the way that, Tarantino's always been given credit for kind of rediscovering actors. I think that what Inarritu did with Michael Keaton, who at that time was not at the best point in his career, the way he kind of brought him back was just brilliant. But I do think that they're all interested in not just having films that take you somewhere in a technical sense. They want you to be invested in the characters. And just to digress really briefly, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Roma was so successful. And I think Roma is a really important film for a number of reasons. I think it's obviously the film with which Cuaron returned to Mexican productions. When you think about Roma, it's an almost 3-hour film in black and white in a particular Mexican dialect. It's a film that had an unknown in the central role who was nominated for an Academy Award. But I think Roma is also really important because I think a lot of people forget the role that Roma played, but Roma was the first kind of Netflix film to not just be invited to festivals, but to win major prizes. I think Roma really changed things for Netflix. But what Cuaron also did, Cuaron was the first director to really say to Netflix, okay, look, I love the fact that you've given me this creative freedom. I love the fact that you've given me this budget. I've delivered to you awards and festival prestige, but I want my film on a cinema screen. Yeah. And Roma was the first film, and Netflix had worked with other auteur figures, Bong Joon-ho and the Coen brothers and others. But Roma really changed things from an industry perspective in that it was the first Netflix film that went into cinemas and not just on the Netflix channel. So I think Roma's a really important film for that reason. But just to go back to what we were talking about, just to prove that this isn't just a long, lengthy digression, I think Roma was also an important film in the same way that something like Parasite was an important film. When Parasite won the Best Picture Oscar, Roma obviously was up for that and should have won. I think Green Book won and Roma obviously should have won. But Roma did win Best Director. The lead actor was nominated. Cuaron, who shot the film himself, was nominated won the Best Cinematographer. But I think Roma, alongside Parasite, was a film which really changed audiences' perspectives of watching films with subtitles. Roma was not just a critical and cultural and awards success, it was a commercial success. That film was seen by a lot of people, both on Netflix and in cinemas. So I think that something like Roma kind of paved the way for Parasite, which really broke down the door because that did win the Best Picture, for a foreign language film. And then you did have Bong Joon-ho in his acceptance speech saying that, the 1-inch subtitle shouldn't be a barrier to audiences. And that's all true. But I don't think that would have been possible without Roma. And this is where I bring it all back together to prove that I hadn't just gone off on a... And I think that the strength of Roma isn't just the fact that it's black and white. It isn't just the fact that it's a film about class and society. So it's a very political film. But I think you've also got at the heart of Roma a very human story. I think that the story of the maid looking after the children, and I think of the sequence, and I don't think this is spoiling it for anybody because it's not a spoiler, and I'm sure a lot of people listening will have seen the film. I think the scene where the maid saves the children from drowning is just one of the most incredible things I can remember seeing in recent cinema. And I think if you watch that film, you forget about the technical brilliance and you just think about how that moment, and that's one of just a number of moments in that film, how that connects on a very humane and emotional level with audiences. I think that is the brilliance of Roma. Not just the fact that it is shot in the dialect and it is black and white, and it is about it's the way it connects with people on that very kind of basic level of, you just think, wow, this is really what the root of humanity is kindness and compassion, and
a sort of visceral connection to cinema. And it is kind of ironic that it came through Netflix because of this, because no film has ever well, no, that's a way too grand exaggeration, but it is a film that vaunts its cinema-ness, if you know what I mean. It's even got a scene in a cinema where the maid is abandoned by her scurrilous boyfriend. Staying with Oscars and achievement and awards, I mean, I noticed that you and we talked about the cover of the book already as well. You've got them brandishing their Oscars on the cover, and personally, I'm a little bit of a sort of anti-Oscars person, merely as a corrective to the way it gets argued about on Twitter, basically. Having said that, I always watch them and I always care passionately about who wins and who loses. But yeah, you really wanted to underline that, I mean, I remember Chariots of Fire winning the Oscars and Colin Whelan shouting, "The British are coming, the British are coming." Well, I mean, the Mexicans came and conquered far more than the British did after Chariots of Fire.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, I mean, in all honesty, it's interesting because I think the directors, they all say in the book that winning the Academy Awards I'm sure it was very nice and I'm sure they like having the awards, but they've all said, that the winning of the awards wasn't necessarily, they didn't necessarily think of it as awards for them. They saw it as validation of their nationality, and they saw it as validation of their country. And I think they realised that having these awards would give them more power in terms of being spokespeople for Mexico and Mexican cinema. They're not particularly, my experience of the directors, they're not particularly ego-driven. I think it was Cuaron actually that said, it's nice to win an Oscar, but I don't think they're at home polishing their statues, but I think they do realise that it gives them a power and a visibility. I think that's what they recognise that it gives them. And as I said, I think they see it as an award for their country. Also, you have to remember the relationship between Mexico and America, which has always been fraught with difficulty, and especially in the era of Trump, where Trump was building the wall and making racist and derogatory comments about Mexico. Mexico is a country which has always existed in the shadow of America, and I think that these awards proved that it was coming out of the shadow. I mean, the front cover, if I'm being honest, you can understand. I mean, when the first book came out, there was never going to be any discussion that the front cover was going to be Gael de Garcia Bernal, because they knew it would sell copies.
Right.
And I think that with this cover, there was a sense that and I'm not disagreeing, the publisher wanted the pictures with the directors with their Oscars on the cover because they knew that it might attract readers possibly that weren't, that maybe weren't as interested in Mexican cinema, because it was Mexican cinema, that they're interested in films that were kind of high-profile films that had won awards, and I have no problem with that. But I did say to Faber, and they're a great publisher, and they've been very good to me. I said, I think the directors would be disappointed if it was just them on the cover. I think they would want to see some of their compatriots on the cover. So, it was always going to be a kind of montage sleeve that would have some of the other filmmakers as well. And I certainly said to Faber that, the big three wouldn't be happy if there wasn't an image. Carlos Regadas didn't want his image on the cover. He's quite shy is the wrong word, but he's not very publicity seeking. But
right.
I think the other directors would have thought it very strange if there wasn't an image, at least from a Regadas film. So we struck a happy balance. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, the idea the Brits are coming, I think for the last, ever since Cuaron won with Gravity, the kind of visibility that these directors have achieved, president of the jury in Cannes, multiple Academy Awards, Inarritu a multi-award winner, Cuaron a multi-award winner, Del Toro nominated a number of times and finally won for The Shape of Water and won big. And as I mentioned earlier, it isn't just the directors that have won. The last kind of 10 years or so, or maybe slightly less, 6 or 7 years of the American Academy Awards. And I think you're right to be slightly dubious of the Academy Awards. I mean, I mentioned Green Book winning over Roma. I personally don't think we should set too much in the Academy Awards. I mean, I think it was I think it was almost more important the fact that something like The Shape of Water won the Audience Award at Toronto and Roma won, I think, the Golden Lion at Venice. You know, I think that they're awards that would probably mean more to the filmmakers. But I think the fact that Mexico has so dominated the Academy Awards just in terms of visibility, and as I said, the last 5 or 6 years, you've had Prieto, Navarro, you know, Gustavo Santaolalla, the composer, you know, they've all just continued to win, you know, yep. and not just won once. Successive wins, successive nominations. You know, I'm sure that in the Trump era, he would have hated that. You know, I remember he hated it when Parasite won. You know, his reaction was, "Oh, what the hell is this? You know, our big award ceremony and a film from Korea is winning," and he would have had exactly the same attitude to the Mexicans winning. So I think it's fun for that reason. I think it's fun.
That's a bit of chili sauce.
Right wing. Yeah.
That's a bit something picante, something. Yeah. No, absolutely. So let's talk, move our attention to the new wave of young filmmakers who are coming out. Obviously, the big four have lots still to offer. They're by no means over, but you mentioned quite a few in the second part of the book. Now, I'm gonna fess up. I'm familiar with Michel Franco and I'm familiar with Amal Escalante. I've seen two of Escalante's films, The Untamed that you already mentioned, The Heli, which is absolutely extreme and hellish vision of the Mexican drug wars. Yes. Highly recommended, I would add, but not for the faint of heart. Certainly, it struck me as a antidote to that sort of, I don't know, slight commodification of the drug wars in series like Narcos, where it sort of becomes, you know, almost like a computer game of elaborate ways in which people can get shot, you know. Whereas Heli, oh man. So I just wanted to.
I think Heli was very much intended as an antidote to that.
Right.
You're exactly right. I mean, that's what I think it wanted to show what the drug wars were really like. And there's another film, Miss Bala, which does something similar, but Heli really does go much further in terms of looking at the reality and the collateral that these drug wars cause, mainly on the working class communities where the wars take place.
Yeah, absolutely. You really get a horrible sensation of, you know, of being in the midst of it, and there are scenes there that you don't necessarily want to watch again, and you certainly don't want to experience. I guess my question is a little bit similar to the one I asked earlier about the Regadas, which is sort of like people who are not so familiar with these filmmakers. Where would you begin, and what would you recommend?
Well, I think again, you know, the film that Michel Franco, who you know, he's got a new film coming called New Order, which I think is going to be quite divisive. But the other thing I was really keen to try and do with this book, and it was a genuine intention, there were two things I wanted to do. I wanted to, you know, I mentioned earlier that the diversity I wanted to explore, and you know, cinema that can't, you know, I think that cinema is an ecosystem from any country. You know, if you look at cinema from England, you could argue that you need the period dramas and the kind of Kingsman, etc. But then you also need the Ken Loach and the Mike Leigh, and then you also need the newer generations of coming through. You know, like Aline Khan, who's just made a brilliant film called Afterlove, and you need Joanna Hogg, and you need the young Black filmmakers like Remy Weeks with his house. You know, you kind of need that broader vision, because I think we're beginning to realise that cinema has to be much more inclusive, both in terms of people that make it and the audiences that it's made for. You know, so I think there's a really interesting dialogue going on at this moment in our existence around that, and I think that's very necessary. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to try and find the Mexican filmmakers that were doing other things. So I was very keen to have some documentary filmmakers. I was very keen to have some Mexican filmmakers that were more from the kind of Regadas art house school, and kind of essayists, you know, filmmakers that weren't necessarily just working within a narrative tradition. But I was also really keen to try and have more women filmmakers, because, you know, I think as well as that dialogue, you know, there's a lot of dialogue around diversity in any cinema, you know, around ethnicity, class, you know, and I think a lot of Mexican cinema is quite often set within working class communities. But there's also a lot of dialogue about, you know, the need to support and sustain films by women. And with the first book, I was really keen to try and interview a filmmaker called Marissa Sistach, who made a film I like very much called Perfume de Violetas, but it just proved impossible to for various reasons to get an interview. So in the end, I wasn't able to interview many women filmmakers, but I interviewed quite a lot of female producers. And it's interesting that in Mexico, a lot of the producers were women. Marta Sosa, who is one of the producers of Amores Perros, Rosa Bosch, who's one of the great figures who helped immeasurably with this book, who's Del Toro's long-time producer, and Berta Navarro. Berta Navarro again worked a lot with Guillermo del Toro. Berta Navarro is one of the kind of great figures in Mexican cinema. She's Guillermo Navarro's sister. So Guillermo Navarro, who worked with Del Toro, nominated and won Academy Awards. But it seemed that there was a lot of power in the production sphere in Mexico that were women, but it seemed quite difficult to find Mexican female filmmakers. So I was very keen to try and find films by and interview women directors from Mexico. And that was one of the really big criteria behind the second volume. And again, I tried and failed to get Marissa Sistach. There were a few others that it just didn't work out, but I was really pleased that I got to interview Lila Aviles. I think Lila Aviles is one of the brightest new voices in Mexican cinema. Lila Aviles made a film called The Chambermaid, which I just think is an incredible film. I think The Chambermaid is almost, if Roma was the A side, then The Chambermaid is the B side of the single. You know, I don't know if you've seen the film, but for listeners, it's about quite a lowly maid who works in a very high class hotel in Mexico City, and it's very much from the perspective of the workers in the hotel. You know, it's a film which is really a parable for Mexican society and the hierarchical structure and the chasm between the haves and the have-nots. And it's a really interesting film, the way that it's all shot through glass. You know, it's a lot of shots through windows. It's a lot of shots of reflections. And I think that Lila Aviles is just an incredibly smart filmmaker with an incredible vision. So I was very keen that film was included. There's another Mexican female filmmaker called Mariana Chinillo, whose work is not that well known here. And the difficulty is that if you're writing a book, as you know, you're hoping that people are going to read it. And again, it goes back to the cover. You know, if you put Del Toro and etc. on the front cover, someone might pick it up. Unfortunately, if you was to just put films by filmmakers who might not have even had work released here, it's going to be more difficult to get people interested. But I almost wanted, you can almost think of it as fishing. The big four were the kind of bait, but I wanted to kind of hook people in and then say, oh, and read about these. So, you know, another filmmaker I wanted to include was Everardo Gonzalez, who's a kind of documentary filmmaker, but very much his work very much straddles fact and fiction. You know, you can watch things and you think, well, is this a documentary? Or and I like his work very much. And also Alonso Ruiz Palacios, who is someone that has had some success outside of Mexico, but he's just made a really interesting film which is on Netflix, which I recommend, called A Cop Movie.
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, because you think you're watching a documentary and then you realise you're not watching a documentary. So I think he's another one that's doing something really interesting with form. So, you know, I really wanted it to be a balance in the interviews between people that everybody would know, you know, the ones we've mentioned, people that some people would know, you know, Amat Escalante and Michel Franco, and then people that people would discover, you know, Lila Aviles, Mariano Chileno, Everardo Gonzalez. I got slightly lucky because The Chambermaid, the Lila Aviles film, was released by New Wave, who also released Carlos Regadas' Our Time. And the film did well, you know, it played at festivals and it achieved a certain kind of visibility. So that helped in terms of having Lila Aviles involved. And I think anyone with a passing interest will probably be aware of The Chambermaid. So I did want to try and untangle the idea that, like a lot of other film industries, the Mexican film industry still has a way to go in terms of parity between the amount of men that make films and the amount of women that make films. So that was something that I very wanted to kind of touch upon in the book.
I think there's a real sense, as I got to the end of the book, of sort of just, well, first of all, collecting a list of films that I want to catch up on and find and ferret out, but also the sense that this isn't going to be the final edition of the book, that there's going to be, in 10-15 years time, you're going to have to do a new edition, because this momentum feels like it's continuing.
And you know, unfortunately, as soon as you do a book, there'll be, you know, I've seen, you know, in Cannes, Directors Fortnight in Cannes and in Critics Week in Cannes, there's 6 excellent Mexican films which at the time of writing the book, you know, it was very much completed over lockdown. These films weren't made. So, you know, there's already 6 or 7 other films that I'm thinking, okay, you know, people are going to read this now the book's out, they're going to see this and think, well, why aren't they in it? So already there are films that are coming that you think, okay, well, they'd be good for the next volume. The next part of the book, I'm actually writing a book with Del Toro, a standalone book with Guillermo del Toro, which will be coming out through Faber. And what I'd quite like to do is I'd quite like to do standalone books with Del Toro, Regadas, Cuaron and Inarritu. I mean, that would be the long-term dream.
Going back to the old version of the Faber and Faber sort of interview book.
Yeah.
Okay, those would be brilliant. I love those books. They were, and I mean, your book follows a sort of oral history structure as well.
Yeah, and that's something I really like. I really like the oral history structure. And I must mention, I mean, I dedicated the book to Walter Donahue, and people that don't know Walter Donahue is really the person responsible for Faber. You know, certainly the film books and all of the kind of Scorsese on books that they were all Walter. I mean, Walter, I think, is the unsung hero of British publishing. You know, he was Wim Wenders' story editor on Paris, Texas. You know, he goes back a long way with cinema, and he's someone that Christopher Nolan and Steven Soderbergh, they always speak to Walter Donahue about their films. And I like that oral history. You know, I like the fact that, you know, I think that books about filmmakers should really be about the filmmaker, and it should be in the words of the filmmaker, which is why I'm quite keen on. I like transcript books because I really think that you get to hear the filmmaker. And what I tried to do with this book, I tried to make my questions as short as possible so that you're not listening to me, you're listening to the filmmakers, because I think that's what people want to hear. But I love those. I mean, you can probably, in my shelves, I think I've got all of those Faber books, and they're all excellent, and they all give a really interesting insight into the filmmaker and filmmaking at a particular time in history, and how approaches to filmmaking has changed. And you know, the Del Toro book, which has been slightly delayed because he's finishing his remake of Nightmare Alley, you know, I think that will be such an interesting book because, as I mentioned right at the start of this, he's just such an authority on cinema. You know, the problem with working with Del Toro is he's so busy. You know, he's finishing Nightmare Alley, but he's already got 6 or 7 other... I mean, he's a workaholic. He's already got 6 or 7 other projects on the go. So it's finding the time to pin him down. But it's something that I'm excited about. And, you know, the other great thing about doing this book is I think that all the people in it realised that it was done with the right intention. It was done for a lot of love for Mexican cinema and the filmmakers. It was done to try and help shine a light. I think I got lucky. You know, most of the things I do have terrible timing, but I think I got lucky with this because the timing was right. And you know, and I've been lucky in being able to maintain a good working relationship with these directors. And you know, I don't think I'm kidding myself. I think they've all written to me and said, we really appreciate what you've done and it's always gratifying to get that. I mean, as you know, and I think this podcast is such a brilliant idea because film books don't necessarily sell huge amounts of copies, and I think people's approach to reading film books has changed slightly because you know, the internet and access to materials really changed things. But you know, I do still think there's a place for books, and I think we have to guard against only having a mainstream culture, whether it's a mainstream film culture or a mainstream culture in general. And I do think there has to be room for people to read about culture which is slightly outside of the mainstream. But I know that for Faber, who are publishing less books, you know, it's harder to cover costs. You know, it's harder to, you know, it's harder to sell the kind of copies that they used to sell. But I also think there has been a bit of a renaissance. You know, I think one of the things that lockdown has done, it's connected people again with artifacts. I think people like physical media now. You know, they like buying a record or a book. They like buying a record or a CD. They like buying Blu-rays. You know, Blu-ray sales have kind of gone up, and I think that they've also gone back to the idea of owning a book as being something which is quite desirable. So yeah. You know, I hope the book does well and repays Faber's faith in it.
I spent, I think, a year on Kindle, just reading on as soon as I got my Kindle, and now I've gone back to not just books but hardback books. Sort of like I never used to read hardback books, but now it's like, no, I need to atone for my Kindle sins with proper heavy books. Speaking of which, what film book would you recommend?
I found this question really hard, actually, and the reason is I'm someone that really enjoys reading film books. I mean, I tend to, at the moment, I'm reading The Big Goodbye, which is I've forgotten the author, but it's another Faber
Sam
book.
Wasson.
Yeah, about kind of Chinatown.
Future guest of the pod.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell him, I think it's an incredible book. I mean, it's an incredible book.
It is, isn't
and obviously,
it? Yeah.
Chinatown is a difficult film at the moment to talk about and write about because of Polanski. But that, that's a book which isn't just about, it is about this kind of changing of the guard in Hollywood. It's a brilliant book. So I found it really hard to pick one book, and without wishing to be greedy, I kind of narrowed it down to 3 books. I narrowed it down to Paul Cronin's book on Werner Herzog, Guide to the Perplexed, which I think is brilliant. I like Colin McCabe's book on Jean-Luc Godard, which I think is brilliant because I'm a big Godard fan. Unfortunately, I've picked all books by men, for which I do apologise. But in the end, I've gone for The Story of Film by Mark Cousins.
Mark Cousins, yes.
Now, the reason I've gone for this book is that Mark Cousins is someone I know a bit, and he's a really passionate advocate for cinema. But because I do read a lot, and because my whole background is in cinema, I really like it when I discover something which I can use as a learning tool. And I can honestly say that from reading The Story of Film, I learned a lot. I pride myself on my cinema knowledge, and I don't say that to sound arrogant. I work in cinema, so I kind of live and breathe cinema. But from reading The Story of Film by Mark Cousins, I learned about aspects of cinema that I didn't know, and particularly an era of Japanese documentary filmmaking in the 1970s. And I discovered a film called The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, and this whole raft of Japanese documentary filmmakers that was completely unknown to me. And I think Mark Cousins has also been very good in talking about how women have been written out of film history. And I've discovered through Mark's writing a whole raft of female filmmakers whose work I didn't know, not just Vera Chiliova, who made Daisies, but, filmmakers from all over the globe. It's a truly international book. And as I said, I think anybody that reads this book will have their understanding and passion for cinema both broadened and reignited.
Yeah, I totally agree. I second that. I just think it's such a virtuous circle that, you read and then you end every book with a list of other films to watch. You watch those films and then you want to find out more about those filmmakers or that particular time in history, and you go back to it, you root out another book, and it has this relationship. The last thing I wanted to mention was the fact that when you were talking about fishing with the big 3 or the big 4 Mexican filmmakers, I think that's an example of those filmmakers would actually like that idea. That yes, that's exactly, we want to use our fame and our Oscar pictures to get people to buy this book to find out about these other filmmakers who are coming up behind us and towards us.
That's exactly what they do, and that's why they were very keen that we don't want this to just be a book about us. We want this to be a book about our industry and our fellow and co-filmmakers, and that I think that was what very much appealed to them. As I said, they're all multiple Oscar winners, but I've always found them refreshingly ego-free. And as I said, they see this book as a film about where they come from and where they began, and I think that's why they were able to be so supportive of it. And I'm very, very grateful to them.
Well, I'm very pleased to recommend it. It's a superb read, and I think it will, if you know a lot about Mexican cinema, it will still tell you a lot. And if you don't know that much, it will open your eyes, open some doors. Thank you so much, Jason, for talking to me today.
Thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure. And as I said, I think that what you're doing with this podcast is such a brilliant idea. And it's been great coming on and having a really insightful and entertaining conversation about it. So my thanks to you, John.
What a fascinating conversation that was. My thanks very much go to Jason Wood. And to remind you, his recommended book was Mark Cousins' The Story of Film. His own book, The Faber Book of Mexican Cinema, is available everywhere. And as you can probably tell, I highly recommend it. It'll open your eyes to quite a few new directions that you could look at. And if you already are au fait with Mexican cinema, there's still plenty to learn. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks very much also to Elliot Atkins for the music included in the podcast. And I'll see you next week.